Okay, welcome to Unit 4. Unit 4 is about ratios and proportions. Not only is ratios and proportions incredibly critical in the health profession, uh, if you have a really strong grasp of ratios and proportions and how to use them, you're going to have no problems passing the HSGQE, and it'll also be helpful for SBAs and things like that. First of all, what is a ratio? A ratio is a way of comparing two things, and they could be similar things or they could be different things. Um, Look around you. How many adults are in the room? How many students are in the room? It might be 1 to 1. Maybe there's one adult and 5 students. Or one thing I like to do, because they say, oh, you can't compare apples and oranges. Well, let's say we can. Let's say there's 3 apples and 5 oranges. So if I'm going to compare the ratio of apples to oranges, and I said there's 3 apples and 5 oranges, there's 2 different ways I can write ratios. Generally, you're going to see them written this way, as 3 to 5. The other way that you can write them, and it's far more useful, I feel, is to write them as fractions, 3 to 5. And what this is considered a part-to-part ratio, and that's mostly what we're going to be working at. The other way to look at a ratio is part to whole. How many oranges are there to fruits? Well, there's 5 oranges. Let me change colors so we know that now we're talking part to whole instead of, this is one part apples to the other part oranges. Now we're talking about part to whole. We're talking about oranges to fruit. So I'm going to say, oh, there's 5 oranges. How much fruit is there? 3 and 5, there's 8. 5 to 8, or I can write it as 5/8. Like I said, we won't be that concerned with part to whole here. For the medical profession, we look at part to part an awful lot. So that's what a ratio is. Now, when we're looking at ratios, what we don't like to do is we don't like to look at them as fractions. In fact, if you look over on page 106, you can see that question 2, for instance, it says the ratio is 7/8 to 14. Is that a ratio? Oh, it certainly is a ratio. It's just not a good way to look at it. We want to look at ratios with whole numbers. One way to eliminate the fraction is always to multiply by the denominator. So if I'm multiplying this here by the denominator, I'm just going to multiply it by 8. Right, 8 is a fraction, and I end up with 8/1. But if I multiply this side by 8, I have to multiply this side by 8. So what happens here, I could just cancel right now and end up with 7/1. Rather than confuse you, let's go ahead and multiply like we learned. 7 times 8, 56. 1 times 8, 8. 32 and 80, 112. Okay, now what's 56 divided by 8? 7 to 112. And that's how you do that. And like I said, your original problem was a fraction and a whole number. After you simplified it, you ended up with a whole number and a whole number. When you're working with fractions, you can eliminate the fraction by multiplying by the denominator. Okay, what if you're working with decimals? Well, if you have something like 1 3/10 to 42, I need to eliminate the decimal to simplify this ratio. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply by 10, because when I multiply by 10, I move that decimal over. 1 3/10 times 10 is 13. So I'm going to multiply by 10 on both sides. Again, I'm doing the same thing, and I end up with 13 to 420. Now this is a simplified ratio because I have a whole number and a whole number rather than a decimal and a whole number. So that's how you eliminate both fractions and decimals. I see also on that page that there is, let's take a look at one more type. What if I have 4 1/3 to 7? Okay, now I have a mixed number and a whole number, and I want to have just whole numbers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to look at the denominator. I'm going to multiply both sides by the denominator. To eliminate confusion, let's change colors. I'm going to multiply by 3, multiply by 3, and this is the easy side. I'll do that first. 21. Remember how to multiply whole numbers and mixed numbers? I'm going to convert 3 to a fraction, and then multiply that by 4 times 3 is 12 plus 1, 13 over 3. At this point, again, if you know how to do it, go ahead. You can reduce 3 and 3, or I can go ahead and multiply out, and I end up with 39 over 3, which reduces or simplifies 39 divided by 3. I end up with 13 to 21. That's a simplified ratio because I have two whole numbers. One of the other things that we look at is unit rates. There's a good example, I think, on page 107. I'm sorry. When you look at ratios in healthcare on page 107, you saw they have a really good example there, and you can see there it says 4 milligrams per milliliter. And what that means is that there's 4 milligrams of the medicine for every milliliter that liquid contains. So in this instance, it's 4 milligrams of lorazepam for each milliliter. The other example that I liked was if you're in a hospital for 3 days and you are charged, so let's say $2,000 in 3 days, and you are charged $2,163. Well, how much does it cost to stay in that hospital per day? And you can set this up as I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh, we're trying to find unit rate now. So with unit rate, I want to set this up as a, let's see, days and cost. Okay. Sorry if I'm getting ahead of myself and confusing everybody. Let's just slow down. What I'm trying to find now is a unit rate, and a unit rate is how much does it cost per day in this instance. But basically what I'm doing is I'm going to use the smaller number. 3 is definitely smaller than 2,163. So I want that in the denominator. I'm going to set this up as a fraction with the smaller number in the denominator. 2,163 over 3. Now, to find a unit rate, I have to make my denominator equal 1. So I will go ahead and just put that in there as 1. And now I have to figure out, how do I get from 3 to 1? That's simple. I divide by 3. Well, if I divided the denominator by 3, I must divide the numerator by 3. And I'll go ahead and do this over on the side. 2,163 divided by 3, 7 times. Enter 0, bring down my 6. 3 goes into 6 2 times. The remainder of 0, bring down my last 3, and just 1 time. And so it cost me $721 to stay in that hospital every day. Hopefully it won't be me. But that's how you find a unit rate. So for practice, there is a IXL practice that you can do, but let's look at one other example. Let's say that you take, let's say 450 breaths per hour in 1 hour, and I want to find out how many in a minute. Well, first thing I'm going to do is convert that to minutes. There's 60 minutes in 1 hour. So breaths, and I have minutes. I need to divide this by 60 to get it to 1. Divide by 60. I'm also going to have to do the same thing here. I already know the answer on the bottom here. That's going to be 1, right? 60 divided by 60. That's the whole point of finding the unit rate, is to make that denominator into 1. Now I have 450 divided by 60. And I got a feeling this isn't going to be a real pretty number, but we'll go with it. 60 goes into, or 6 goes into 45 7 times, so let's try 7. 0, 420, subtract off, I end up with 30. Oh, that's not going to be too bad. So put my decimal point there, add a 0, bring that 0 down. 60 goes into 300 5 times. So I have 7.5 breaths per minute. I think that's about an average rate. Okay. Now let's look at proportion. Proportion and unit rate and ratio, they're all very closely tied together. The proportion is what helps you solve things. And I'll show you what I mean. For instance, if you have to take 2 grams of medication, you need to take 2 of those for every pound that you weigh, per pound. So 2 grams for 1 pound, and you happen to be 89 pounds. All I do is I set this up as equal proportions, and that gives me a ratio, or equal ratios, and that gives me a proportion. And now I have to just figure out how many grams of this medication do I need to get. Well, I multiplied my denominator by 89 to get to 89, so I have to multiply my medication by 89. 2 times 89, it might be easier just to add them twice, 89 plus 89, but I'll go ahead and multiply. 2 times 9 is 8, carry a 1. 2 times 8 is 16, plus 1, 17. So I need to give that patient who weighs 89 pounds, I need to give them 178 grams of this medication. I think that's enough for this clip, and then we'll go ahead and start a new clip. Oh yeah, this one is much too long. Sorry to keep it so long. Let's get to a new video.